Our talk today is forest farming in Connecticut. We're here at the Hickories Farm in Ridgefield, Connecticut, and our hosts are Camilla Ledesma and Laura Green.
Thank you all for being here. We're going to get started. Obviously, we're an intimate group, so this is going to be hopefully informational, and also there'll be lots of opportunity for conversation as we go. My name is Laura Green. My job is I'm the research and extension forester for the Yale Forest. So I'm employed by the Yale Forest, which is part of the Yale School of the Environment. And we have responsibility for management, stewardship of about 10,000 acres of forest land, most of which is in Connecticut. And in that position, I also get to be involved in this work through being part of the Northeast Forest Farmers Coalition, the NFFC, which is a network of people who are interested in the practice of forest farming and in these plants in our region. For me, it's really a dream because in addition to my background in forestry, I also have a great love for all the plants, not just the trees, and was working as a field botanist and have done some work on rare species in that capacity in the past. So I was very excited to kind of link up with NFFC when I started in my current job and saw there was a sort of place where we were talking about all of the things that I care about personally. So that's how I am here today. Camila, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Camila. I am working basically as a research assistant on this project this summer with the Northeast Forest Farmers Coalition. My background is in environmental studies, and I'm particularly interested in food sovereignty. And so, I majored in environmental studies for undergrad at Yale, and I continued at the Yale School of the Environment and just graduated with my master's in environmental management. And during this year, back at school, I kind of stumbled upon the work of the NFFC. I was looking for ways to be involved in something that was community organizing related and also food sovereignty, and hadn't really had so much experience with the world of medicinal plants and botanicals. And so this has been an amazing introduction to that. And yeah, we're really excited to share with you some of the findings we have from our explorations into this legal landscape, as well as some best practices around working with the ecology of these plants and conserving these rare species. Hey. And so, yeah, we would love for Dina, if you would not mind when you have finished eating.
we called on you at the wrong moment.
If you want to give like an intro to the farm space. Dina is amazing and is letting us use this space to host the workshop, and has been doing some really awesome seed saving work and runs this farm. So yeah, super grateful.
Yeah, so welcome to the Hickories. The land that we are on is the traditional territory of the Golden Hills tribe. And so a lot of the foodways that we'll be talking about today will make reference to their stewardship of this place. My grandparents came to this land in 1936, so it's been in our family's stewardship for quite a while. And had a lot of different lives. So as we walk around today, you'll see we're certified organic in fruit and vegetable production. We have pastured livestock, and I've just come to this work really around forest farming in the last couple of years, but have been interested in ecological seed production and worked with obviously many of you through that work in the Northeast Seed Collective. And welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. We're very lucky to get to be here. I feel like this is like kind of an incredible setting to be like giving a PowerPoint presentation.
So yeah, we'll start by just telling you a little bit more about the NFFC, or the Northeast Forest Farmers Coalition. It was founded 5 years ago in 2021. Karim Shaban, who is recently a professor of agroforestry at UNH and was doing his PhD through Marlisa's lab, has helped start the NFFC after working with Rural Action out in Ohio, and I think the Appalachian Forest Farmers Coalition as well. And essentially, so we're a grant-funded project. Right now, we're housed at the Yale School of the Environment, but the idea for the project is for it to be a network of community members who are able to, sell plant products to each other or share resources. Basically, whatever you can ideate, we'd love to hear about and just kind of expand the work of the network. And yeah, it says a little bit about, we have various stakeholders. So we work with farms, we work with universities, landowners to see what kind of management or forest farming they might be interested in for their forested land. And a big goal of ours is just getting people more connected with the place that they are living in and understanding the ecology of where they live, and also promoting economic and ecological resilience through cultivating these plants. One of our mottos is conservation through cultivation. And we can get into the nuances of that. All right, so we'll start by defining what forest farming is, at least according to these existing entities. The definition on the right here is from Farming the Woods, which I brought a copy of that's on the table there if you want to take a look at it later. But the combination of crops and trees and forest-inspired agricultural systems that benefit human communities, kind of as we were talking about this human element of why the NFFC exists. It's for all of you, and ensuring that we can steward these lands for generations to come. And then the National Agroforestry Center has a more less human-centric definition, but essentially cultivating high-value crops in the forest and ensuring that there are like correct shade levels and other qualities of the land, characteristics that are beneficial for these plants. And we'll talk a little more about the plants soon. So forest farming is a really sort of interesting, like Marlise was mentioning, intersection of a lot of different traditions, horticulture, agriculture, but also it has historical origins and medicinal usage of these plants that we'll talk about, like ginseng, golden seal, bloodroot, in indigenous communities before European colonization. So yeah, we're talking about native plants here that were here before the colonial project. And similar traditions exist all over the world and in various medicine traditions. We'll get into a little bit about ginseng's role in Chinese medicine, with Asian ginseng and American ginseng having different uses. One promotes yin, one promotes yang energy in that tradition. So kind of a meeting of many worlds. And why forest farm? You all already mentioned some reasons of conservation, connection to land, education. I think there's just a long list. So promoting biodiversity in the forest. These are all very slow growing plants. And so at least in the sort of framework that we're working in, cultivating them, stewarding them, especially with the rise of invasive species in our forests, is pretty essential to ensuring that they last on this landscape. Can be very beautiful. A lot of these plants, I know for myself, bloodroot is like my favorite. The leaf is just so pretty. Diversifying crops, supplemental income for maybe you have a farm that's kind of a field cultivated, but you also have woods, and this could be a way to get some sort of side income for your business. And yeah, similarly, these plants will benefit a forest landscape for erosion control and restoration. And if someone is actively managing their forest for timber, Some of these plants, depending on their shade needs, can also act as kind of a bridge crop when you're not harvesting timber. So yeah, as I mentioned, conservation through cultivation instead of wild harvesting. I'll get a little bit into like the history of ginseng harvesting in this country, which was known to really deplete wild populations. Cultivating the forest can be a way to counteract that and have a sustainable mode of stewardship. Yeah. There's a big list of reasons from our own members from surveys we've done, and it's a very beautiful, really diverse set of perspectives that all kind of coalesce on this practice of forest farming. So we can get into a little bit of the specific products that one might want to forest farm. Sometimes from the forestry perspective, these are referred to as non-timber forest products, a little bit centering the timber there, but anyway, not wood that you can get from a forest. So here's a long list of potential plants that one might be, and syrups that one might be interested in cultivating. We'll talk a little bit about ginseng. Ginseng is kind of a cure-all, is used for vitality, for stomach aches. I think some studies have looked into it as a cancer drug that helps with the effects of radiation therapy. So a lot of potential in these plants as medicine. So I assume that a lot of people here know what a ginseng plant looks like, but if you don't, here are some photos. So a mature plant tends to have, we call each of these fronds, and each frond has 5 leaflets on it. They have red berries, and they're mostly valued for their roots. And there's a really large existing market, especially that exports to China and Hong Kong for the roots. Ginseng takes around 5 to 10 years to reach maturity, so it's a slow growing plant. It's very disease prone, and so it can be cultivated in a field setting, but when the plants are grown very close together, they're more prone to fungal diseases. And so having them in a forest setting where they're not super close together, sometimes people plant golden seal between them to act as like an antifungal, is a more sustainable method of cultivating them. And they are dispersed mostly by gravity, so the seeds fall and then the next plant grows. Some birds, I think, also disperse them. And Laura will also talk more about like site selection later on. So. Okay, brief historical tangent. Basically, when people discovered that ginseng was so high value, there was this big push to harvest wild ginseng. Previously, ginseng was a medicinal crop. Like I mentioned, it was used in for stomach ailments, for energy, by the Ojibwe, Muskogee, and Meskwaki people long before colonization, but it was quote unquote discovered in the 1700s and was one of the US's first export crops. As I mentioned, Asian ginseng grows in Asia, but it has a slightly different medicinal use than American ginseng. So these people found that exporting it was a profitable market opportunity without really, at the time we didn't have the Endangered Species Act and it wasn't endangered. And so there wasn't like this ethic around how much are we cultivating and how much are we ensuring or not ensuring the future longevity of this plant. So as you can see there, I also say, so the cultivation industry emerged as the wild populations declined. So ginseng began to be cultivated in these field settings where it can only survive for around 3 years before a fungal pathogen might affect the population. Here are some old photos of how ginseng used to be grown under these, I don't know what these are called, but essentially to create shade for the plant artificially, it requires some infrastructure. And this is still how most ginseng is grown today in the US. So today, most of the ginseng farms are in Wisconsin, in this specific county, Marathon County, which exports 80% of all of the US ginseng, which is a tenth of the world market, so a lot. And this is all field cultivated. One thing that I'll also mention is that these field cultivated roots grow differently than the wild ones. So wild roots tend to be kind of like gnarled and can kind of resemble even like a human being with like arms and legs. And those are really highly valued abroad because they can be given as like wedding gifts. That's the sort of tradition. The field cultivated ginseng doesn't grow that way. It has like a more, it's straighter and maybe will be turned into powders for medicine. So it has a slightly lower value financially. Yeah, so there is a lot of disease pressure in these kinds of settings. And so the solutions to that are fungicide applications and also like moving the locations of the plants over time to kind of try to combat it. But it's definitely just a more vulnerable setting for ginseng. A small proportion of the pounds of ginseng that are exported are from the wild. Hopefully they're wild stewarded or wild simulated or woods grown, but they may also be poached or coming from sort of illegal sources that end up depleting native populations. Okay, golden seal, also very beautiful plant. The reproductive form has 2 leaves on one stem and the berry between the leaves, and the root has like a very golden color, as you can see. And golden seal has some similar uses to ginseng, like it can be used for stomach aches. And this plant is also slow growing, a little less than ginseng. It takes 3 to 6 years to reach maturity, and it is dispersed by gravity, the seeds, but also through the rhizome, so it can clone itself. Black cohosh, another plant that we're interested in, has these like beautiful upright fronds when it's flowering. And this plant is valued for menopausal symptoms and also for its root. Though we can also kind of talk about how a lot of these plants are valued for their roots, but the leaves are also, for example, for ginseng, just as effective. I'm not sure for black cohosh, but that's another sort of potential market to be thinking about. And then bloodroot, which is, as I mentioned, my favorite leaf. It's kind of very characteristic of this region. Just anecdotally, I find it in the woods more often than the other plants that we've been talking about. And this can be used actually as a natural dye because of its name. Its root is very, very red, and the leaves kind of contain this. It kind of looks like blood if you break a small piece. And this plant, interestingly, requires ants to be dispersed, which Dina and I were talking about. So ants will like kind of take the seeds and eat this part of the seed that's like an appendage, and then like store the seeds somewhere. And that's kind of how bloodroot can spread, which is just like pretty cool. Ramps. So if you're from this area, you might have like gone to a ramp festival before. Ramps have culinary usages, and they're valued for these bulbs. We recently had Ramps ice cream. So people make like Ramps butter, which is really good because it kind of works with the garlic taste. The ice cream is more experimental.
It was a little divisive. I thought it was great, but not everyone agreed.
Yeah. Ramps they kind of like grow you can find them in patches in the forest. They're kind of an ephemeral plant. So you'll see the leaves come up for like a few weeks maybe in the spring, and then those will die back, and then the like flower stalk comes up, and you'll see some of those in the woods today. Yeah, generally, so for anyone who has experience with foraging, you don't want to pick more than like 10 to 15% of an existing population. And if you can leave some of the plant so that it can regenerate, that's ideal. Part of the reason that we're promoting forest farming generally is so that we're not depleting wild populations.
Ramps in particular are one of the easiest of these plants to grow, and people have a lot of luck with starting things from seeds in their backyard. And it's pretty, if you have a patch of forest that has reasonable conditions, to have your own kind of personal ramp patch. Like a lot of people have a relationship with ramps in that way, rather than like buying a sad, very expensive bunch of wilted, wild collected ramps at a market somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Many other plants and syrups that you can harvest from the forest. So shiitake mushrooms, maybe people have shiitake mushroom logs that they've worked with, pawpaws, the hickories. We were just talking about hickory nut milk, maple syrup. I know some people experimenting with birch syrup as well. Yeah, this can be a way to know your forest and manage production systems that I've kind of mentioned, but just to get clear on like the definitions. Wild harvested or wild stewarded is when, like we were talking about with the wild ramps, you go out into the woods, you find a wild population, you take 10%. You're essentially like stewarding that wild population.
And this idea of wild stewardship incorporates like a forward-thinking perspective of trying to promote the long-term sustaining of a population of that plant in that place.
So yeah, we have wild harvested, wild stewarded between those. Wild simulated is essentially planting in the forest, kind of trying to mimic the existing ecosystem. So your plants aren't going to be like in a bed. They'll be maybe kind of disparately arranged on the forest floor. And Laura will talk more about how to identify a site that would work well for these plants that we've been talking about. So woods grown is another category where you're not working with a wild population. Again, you're planting seed or rootstock, and the plants are much closer together, kind of in a bed. So just like you would prepare like a raised bed in your garden, you would do this in the woods. And this has like pros and cons where you can fit more plants in an area. So you might make more of a profit from that just because you have more plants. But also depending on the disease resistance of the plants, you might not be able to grow them for as long. Like ginseng, it's ideal if you can get a root that's like 10 years old, and maybe you'd be able to achieve that in a wild simulated setting, but a woods grown setting, they might become diseased before that. I think the Wild Hudson Valley says that maybe in a woods grown setting, you could get like 5 to 7 years out of ginseng. And then, as we were talking about with the Wisconsin farms, field cultivation is the most conventional way to grow these plants. It can be done at a huge scale, but also is not really sustainable and involves a lot of chemical applications. So intensiveness scale. Wild simulated is kind of the least intensive method that doesn't involve sort of potentially harming wild populations. So these two methods are kind of what NFFC is most focused on. So really quickly, I'll talk about a little bit of like the market opportunities of these plants in the Northeast. The idea here is essentially that the Northeast has a lot of forested land. Wasn't always that way, but because of that and because of the sort of breakdown of who owns that land, like private landowners have power in how this land is managed. And so this is a good opportunity for forest farming and kind of making sure that this knowledge and education is like spread around the region. And this is just some of the breakdown of how much money is involved in each of these different markets for the plants. So maple syrup, very high value, as is ginseng, but golden seal is comparable, and black cohosh as well. Plenty of opportunities for selling plant material. You don't have to be selling roots to sort of enter these markets. So you can be selling planting stock, for example. Here are some other market opportunities and ways that you can process these plants into salves, tinctures, or pickling them. And there's just a note about leaf harvest, where you can harvest the leaves and they'll be often as potent as the roots. And this is a more sustainable method of cultivation, especially if you're working with a wild population.
Let's take a step back and talk a little bit about rarity as a concept. So organisms are rare based on their number of occurrences. So that would be like the number of pandas there are, or the number of, this picture down here is New England blazing star, which is a really beautiful endangered plant that grows in our region. So those could be endangered because there's not very many of them, and or there's some kind of persistent threat to the continued existence of that particular organism. Like poaching, sure, yes. Or yeah, clearing all of the bamboo forests in China or whatever. Importantly, rarity is a scale-dependent concept. So something can be rare globally. So there's very few pandas anywhere. It could be rare at the level of the country. It could be rare at the level of the state. It could be rare in your woods. So scale is important. There are lots of different reasons why something could be rare. In some cases, some organisms just have really specific habitat requirements, and we would call this a sort of a fundamental limitation. So they might need really specific conditions to grow in, and they just are not going to grow, or they won't live outside of those conditions, and there's just not a lot of that on our landscape. So that's one reason. For some species, they have a slow rate of growth, a slow rate of reaching sort of reproductive success, or they don't move very far very fast, so they don't disperse out of an area very well. That is the case for a lot of the species that we're talking about for forest farming are in that camp. Sometimes they might have pretty broad habitat requirements, but a lot of that habitat has been lost or destroyed. They may be near the edge of their sort of natural range. Often that'll make something rare. They may be facing a bunch of competition from perhaps a new introduced species. There may be pest pathogens or predators at play, perhaps newly at play if it's a newly rare species. There may be overharvesting, harvesting beyond the levels that the sort of wild population, naturally occurring populations can sustain. Very often there's some combination of these factors at play, and sometimes we don't really know. We just know we've gone out, we've looked, we've counted, and there's not a lot of it. In general, in the world of plant conservation, we care the most about naturally occurring populations of a species. And the first preference is to preserve species where they are. So preserve the habitat and preserve the populations that are already on the landscape. We call that in situ conservation. Our sort of second option, second priority from a conservation perspective would be to preserve plants, preserve species somewhere else other than where they're found naturally growing in the wild. One option is through living collections in like botanical gardens. This is a photo of the Coastal Maine Botanical Garden, which is doing ex situ conservation of New England blazing star in the garden. And they have a whole program there where they work with conservation agents of the state, and they're sustaining that plant in the garden. We also do sort of I guess, seed and germplasm banking is still alive, but you're just not growing the whole plant, just in a different place. But we also do things like seed bank. So this is the Svalbard seed bank in the Arctic. So just keeping the seeds very, very cold and hoping that they live for a long time. So those are forms of ex situ conservation. So they're conserving the species, but not necessarily keeping it growing in the exact location it was growing previously. And all this conversation about rarity, I think, begs the question about how do we figure out if something is rare and how do we track it? A lot of this is based on historical records. So somebody goes out and writes a big long list of the plants that they see in a location at some point in the past. And we look back at that 100 years later, 200 years later, and we say, oh, here's how things have changed. In botany, old botanists did a lot of going out and just finding something that was interesting, pressing it, and putting it in their herbarium. A lot of these people had like personal herbaria, so collections of pressed plant samples. Oh, this is a collection that's at Kew Gardens, actually, that was collected in Maryland in 1903. Taken together, sort of these collections we have in herbaria and then past survey records that people did in the past are often the basis of our sense of if something is rare, how rare it is, and if that trend is changing over time. That then gets augmented with data from the present in the form of field surveys. So botanists go out and look and see if they can find a plant growing in a place that it used to grow in, and then they inform the state about what they found or didn't find. And just members of the public can submit observations of things. So any of you could say, oh, I was out in my woods and I found this plant that I know is rare, and I'm going to let folks know about it so that can be incorporated into this body of knowledge around like where plants are on our landscape that get tracked long term. Not everybody wants to do that, but that is how that data sets gets put together. So taking that all together, we have these historical records and targeted field surveys to look at where things are growing on the landscape now. And we put that information together and look at how things are changing, what the trends are, if they're decreasing, if they're increasing. That information then goes into sort of state level decision making around what species should be included on this list of threatened, endangered, and species of conservation concern. And then the occurrences of individual species, so a population of a plant, get tracked at the state level. There are some general ways that we use to track rarity and think about rarity across different species and taxa, so groups of species, and across the world, generally based on the number of occurrences of that organism. So that might be individual rhinos, it might be individual plants, or it might be populations of a plant. We don't need to get into great detail of like reading everything that's on this list, but just to point out that it's sort of a heat map from secure, so there's no sort of conservation threat perceived to the species, which is down here in the blue, up here to the red, which is it's critically imperiled, and then the gray color means that organism used to be in a place and we think it's not there anymore. So here is a map showing that ranking level for 3 of our forest botanicals that get used in forest farming: American ginseng, golden seal, and black cohosh, all of which have a sort of native range across the eastern part of the United States. One thing to notice, without getting super, super fixated necessarily on what's the status in each state, is that we have different heat maps for these 3 different species, and you see a range of how rare something is across its geographic range. So ginseng in the like New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, is pretty secure. There's a lot of that plant on the landscape. In the Northeast and at the western edge of ginseng's range, that's not the case. It's quite rare. And we see sort of similar patterns for these other plants, for golden seal and for black cohosh as well. This is all just sort of like, how do we know if something is rare? How do we describe how rare it is based on the number of occurrences that there is? And that then leads us to the question of how this gets translated into law, because it has been translated into law. Internationally, we have Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species, CITES. Yeah. CITES is an international agreement between national governments that governs the trade of rare species around the world. And this applies to plants, it also applies to animals. At the national level, we are covered by the US Endangered Species Act, right? That covers the whole country. None of the botanicals that we're talking about are listed under the National Endangered Species Act. And then at the state level, we have our own state level Endangered Species Act. So the state of Connecticut has its own Endangered Species Act. And all of the other surrounding states have their own Endangered Species Act. And those laws are different. They're written differently and they have different provisions in them. A little bit more detail on CITES specifically. because this is really important in understanding ginseng and golden seal specifically. So this is, as I was saying, it's a voluntary agreement between like national governments essentially, but it includes most of the countries in the world. There are 185 parties that have signed on to it. CITES has its own list of species that are covered under the treaty, and they're listed at different levels. They can either be Appendix 1, Appendix 2, or Appendix 3 species, and ginseng and golden seal are both Appendix 2 species. In fact, they've picked ginseng as the poster child for this infographic from CITES, which is fun. But essentially, depending on the level at which something is listed under CITES, there are different regulations around whether it can be moved across borders and what provisions need to be in place for that to be able to happen and be above board. In the US, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service is the entity that issues permits under CITES for import and export of organisms or products made from organisms that are listed on these three appendices. And U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service deputizes individual states to determine their own permitting requirements for ginseng and golden seal. Ginseng is really the place that this comes up. There's not really state level programs around golden seal. To get a CITES export permit, that is needed if someone is going to sell a CITES listed species outside of the country. So interstate trade, this is not relevant to. If I'm growing something in Hamden and I'm coming out here to sell it to Dina, that's not covered under this. It's international. But there are some requirements that apply there for our Appendix 2 species, which include ginseng and golden seal. To get a permit to export, essentially there needs to be a determination that that export is not detrimental to the long-term survival of the species and it was acquired legally. And U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has some baseline requirements around that, and then they allow states to set their own requirements. At the moment, there are 19 states and one federally recognized tribe, the Menominee, that allow ginseng harvest and export for sale from wild populations. This is the map of all the states that do have CITES export programs for ginseng. The red states on this map allow ginseng export writ large. That includes wild collected plant material. The orange allow only if it was grown sort of artificially propagated, not wild harvesting, exactly. And you will see that Connecticut and the rest of our southern New England neighbors do not have an allowable harvest program under CITES. There would not be a legal pathway to export ginseng or golden seal from Connecticut abroad. Yeah, so going down a level, as I was mentioning, national ESA doesn't list any of these species. So national ESA laws are not like applicable to any of these species because they're not listed under it. That then gets down to the state level. And those laws, the state level laws are what are going to be governing that question about sale between states or within a state. And they vary really widely. So some states have laws that prohibit any, quote, unlawful taking. So that would be destruction or killing an organism, including a plant that is on their state endangered species list. Other states prohibit taking a plant if it's for a commercial purpose, so if it's going to be sold, but they don't have a prohibition if it's not for a commercial purpose, like if somebody did it by accident or I don't know if they were like wanted to use it at home and they weren't selling it. And some have no real enforceable measures of any kind. They just basically say, here's how we as a state are going to decide which species might be endangered in our state or not endangered in our state. And here's the state agency that's deputized to do that decision making, but there's no real teeth to any laws around what a person in that state could do regarding those species. In general, there's a state natural heritage program that is responsible for determining the species that are listed and then anything else that's sort of legislated into the Endangered Species Act around that species. In Connecticut, that's the CTDEEP, the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, is that our natural heritage program, specifically the Natural Biodiversity Database Program, NDDB. Under state endangered species acts, organisms are listed at a particular level. Either they're listed as endangered, threatened, or special concern. And these are not exactly the same as those numbered rankings that we saw on that earlier slide. So like S1, S2, but they're related. So the level of rarity generally informs the status that something is listed at. This is from the Massachusetts State Endangered Species Act. In Connecticut, taking of endangered or threatened species is unlawful if it's being taken willfully to take an endangered or threatened species for the purpose of selling. And it doesn't matter in this case if it is on privately owned land. It's still not legal if it's being harvested with the intention to sell it. This applies to, as you'll note here, it just lists endangered and threatened species. There is a separate section where it talks about special concern. So special concern is a separate category. It's not the same as threatened or endangered, but it's on the same list, essentially. It's another category that an organism can be determined into. If a species is of special concern, then the commissioner can make sort of an emergency prohibition on takings of that plant if they're worried about undue depletion of the organism within the state. Threatened and endangered species are always covered. Special concern species are not covered in the same way by this prohibition on takings for sale, but they could be easily subject to a prohibition if the commissioner decided to. And once again, there's a fine and a penalty associated with that. In Connecticut, planting, growing, harvesting, selling any crop that is not threatened or endangered under the state ESA is legal. Planting and growing crops or species that are listed as threatened or endangered is legal. There's nothing illegal about planting something. Planting, growing, and harvesting something for personal use, not for the purpose of sale, is legal. That's not prohibited under law. Selling, however, a species that was grown in Connecticut and is on Connecticut's state threatened and endangered list is not legal. That is prohibited under law. And then there's this somewhat murky middle ground of selling crops that are grown in Connecticut that are a species that is on this special concern list. And this is of interest because ginseng is listed as a special concern species in Connecticut. And golden seal is listed as endangered. So golden seal, not legal to grow and sell golden seal that's grown in the state of Connecticut under current state law because it is a state endangered plant. And the state law doesn't make any distinction between if something is wild harvested or if it's been grown intentionally from seeds or rootstock that were acquired by a person through, other legal means. You would not be able to export either from Connecticut internationally because you cannot do that legally without a CITES export permit, and Connecticut doesn't offer that for ginseng or golden seal. And then for ginseng, this question about what is the legality for ginseng in Connecticut, at the moment, it is not illegal to plant, grow, and sell ginseng grown in the state of Connecticut because it is a special concern species listed at that level and not threatened or endangered under state law. That is our understanding based on the way the law is written. This Connecticut Deep Commissioner has the authority to prohibit selling any special concern species or any actually takings of any special concern species at any time if they deem it necessary. And so if anybody is thinking about growing this plant, that is important to know as well if people are thinking about wishing to sell it in the future because it is still a special concern species. And again, there's no pathway for export. All of that said, all of these other plants are not listed as threatened, endangered in Connecticut and would be legal to plant, grow, and sell if you wanted to in the state. That all sort of sets us up to then talk a little bit about what literally people might do when they're thinking about working with any of these plants or with forest farming generally. We just talked about some of the legal stuff. We're going to also talk about some of the beyond just strictly what the law says we have to do or are allowed to do or not allowed to do. In general, how do we think about working with these plants given the sort of rarity dynamic? So whenever I'm talking about these plants and to anybody about working with these plants, always want to do that with the ultimate sort of goal and mindfulness that we are trying to protect existing wild populations of these species where they are growing already. And when we talk with people about this, we often hear sort of like primary concern or fear around working with these species at all is the concern that one might accidentally plant in or near an existing wild population, and that might have some kind of negative impact on that wild population's genetics. So that's one concern that we hear. The other concern, I think, in working with these plants is that often what we look for in terms of good habitat for some of these botanicals, also good habitat for other rare species. So we also don't want to accidentally be impacting other rare species that might be living in the same area, particularly around doing like things like site preparation or how you're planting. So those are sort of two main concerns that we often have when we're thinking about forest farming as a practice. And so I want to talk a little bit about how we approach things with that in mind. The first is always emphasizing to folks to get to know the site that you're thinking about working on and where you're planting. Go out and get a good understanding of what your site is like before you plant. For one thing, that's going to help inform, is this actually a good site to plant? Does it have the qualities that I'm looking for? And it's also you're going to learn about what's growing there already. So ideally, go out a few times over the course of a year and get to know what's growing there in different seasons. There is also, through CT Deep, a really awesome site assessment tool that they offer through their Easy File portal, which is a website. That's the link, but you could also just Google like Easy File portal. You do have to sign up and make an account, but once you do, you can essentially draw a polygon on a map of an area that you're interested in. So say an area that you're thinking like, I want to do some forest farming here, or anything else, I guess, you wanted to know about. You draw a polygon on a map, and the site assessment tool will automatically generate a list of possible species of conservation concern and also rare habitat types that might be on or near the site that you have indicated to them. Important caveats for that. One is that this doesn't trigger any further review by NDDB staff, so you are not going to get a call from Connecticut State Botanists if you put in a report request from here. The other thing to know is that what it generates for you, the report, is not saying necessarily all of these organisms live within your polygon. It may be saying this organism, we know it used to live in this polygon. We're not sure it still lives there. We know it lives nearby. It's a starting point to say, if it spits out a list to me that has a bunch of rare plants that share the same habitat type of where I'm going to be working, I should maybe go take a close look for those particular species before I start working. So there's really interesting research that's happening here around, do we have a sort of northeastern genotype that exists for this is for ginseng. I'm talking about ginseng here because we have the most work on that we've done at NFFC. But at the moment, we have a real problem around how we source things. So we do not have that planting stock doesn't exist for the Northeast. There's a lack of even seed or rootstock that was grown here, regardless of the sort of genetic origins. And there's definitely a lack of material that has sort of northeastern genetics that we can then sell to people or give to people to plant out in the region. And as has been mentioned, most of the seed and rootstock that is in circulation today for ginseng is coming from these large commercial production farms in Wisconsin and Ontario. Part of this, the sort of question about this, and that we will kind of ask folks to maybe think about if you're thinking about forest farming for yourself, is how we source seed and rootstock ethically. So our partners at Smoky House Center in Vermont are sort of piloting a program to try and source seeds from folks in the Northeast for other species, but we are not touching ginseng or golden seal in this effort. In addition to thinking about how we source materials, also really want to invite people to think about keeping track of what you're doing. If you're planting any of these plants in the woods, certainly if you're thinking about selling them for any reason in the future, sort of general best practices to keep track of any surveys you do of your site before you start planting, like what was out there, sort of documenting there was not an existing wild population on the site before I planted here. keeping track of where you got your seed or rootstock from, and where and when you planted what, and any other kind of like site preparation or amendments. These are things that are important for, as Marlise was mentioning, United Plant Savers has this Forest Grown Verified certification, third-party certification program for forest farm herbs. And this is all information that they ask about in that certification process. It also would have to imagine if there's ever a point in the future where a legal pathway were to develop in any of the states that it doesn't already for export, you would need to have that information on hand. The other piece of this is trying to help minimize extra work for our very hardworking state conservation agencies. So our state conservation agencies are generally pretty underfunded and short-staffed, and they have a responsibility to monitor wild populations of listed species. So they are anxious, I think understandably, about if people start going out and creating new populations of listed species, are they going to get mixed up and think that this population you planted is in fact a wild naturally occurring population, in which case they would have a responsibility to monitor it. And so there's a sort of a question about, is this going to create extra work for our state conservation agencies that they don't feel prepared to take on? So that's something that we can do to sort of help them out in that way, making sure that it's documented.